The gavel cracked, and the room forgot to breathe. Maya Quinn said, "This isn't justice, it's choreography." Jonah Park stared at the floor as if it might answer. Elena Brooks said, "Inhale, Jonah, then look up." Riley Tran slipped a folded sketch into my palm. Caleb Ortiz said, "We move when the hall clears." Victoria Hale smiled like a velvet curtain closing. The judge droned, and cameras blinked like flies. Maya said, "Someone scripted this verdict last week." Jonah said, "Avery deserved better than this." Elena said, "Hold steady and let truth collect itself." My phone began to vibrate, like a warning. Maya said, "Answer or lose the night." The call hissed, and a voice said, "You missed the box in evidence B." Victoria stepped into a shadow and forgot to leave footprints. Caleb said, "We're burning daylight we don't have." Riley said, "The sketch is a map, not art." Maya said, "Then we follow the lines and break theirs." The apartment smelled like rain and old books, and Jonah kept the sealed letter on the table like a live wire. Maya said, "The call pointed to evidence B, and that means a handler." Elena said, "Sit, warm your hands, then speak." Riley hovered by the window, sketching the hallway like it might confess. Caleb said, "I swept the block, but a sedan idled twice." Victoria's name arrived on the TV crawl, polished and calm. Maya said, "She collects favors and seasons them with fear." Jonah said, "Avery used to hum when the truth felt close." Elena said, "Then hum for her now." Riley said, "The map is of people, not streets." Caleb said, "I know everyone's order. I don't know everyone's price." Maya said, "We test the chain and snap the weakest link." The newsroom buzzed like a beehive, forced into silence by dread. Maya said, "My files are gone, but the dust remembers." Caleb said, "Backups live off-site, I'll pull them." Elena said, "Who had a key to your desk?" Riley said, "I saw a badge clone in the lobby," the reader stuttered. Victoria called a press conference and promised sunlight while building a deeper night. Jonah said, "Avery emailed me a draft report I never opened." Maya said, "We read it now, every comma." Elena said, "Compassion without spine becomes complicity." Caleb said, "We escalate quietly." Riley said, "Or loudly enough to break their rhythm." Maya said, "We move both ways and make them slip." The tower office overlooked the city like a chessboard under glass. Victoria said, "You mistake noise for evidence." Maya said, "I record patterns, not noise." Victoria said, "Patterns are stories you sell." Caleb waited in the lobby, quiet as a lockpick. Elena said, "Words can hold or cut. Choose." Riley texted a photo of a storage cage with a missing padlock. Jonah said, "The verdict read like a rehearsal." Victoria said, "Your grief makes you credulous." Maya said, "Your poise makes you predictable." Elena said, "We can still leave with grace." Riley said, "Or with receipts." Caleb said, "I found the access log spliced." Victoria smiled, and the city dimmed by a degree. Basement archives breathed like a sleeping animal, and the lights hummed secrets in Morse. Maya said, "Rows C through F are short by 7 boxes." Caleb said, "Badge pings show a ghost at 2:13 a.m. Riley said, "This is where walls listen." Elena said, "Stay close and speak softly." Jonah touched a file drawer and flinched. Maya said, "Avery flagged, forged, lab results in her draft." Caleb said, "The chain of custody bends here." Riley said, "I sketched the splices, they form a name." Elena said, "Mercy is not the same as silence." Jonah said, "She tapped her pen when the lie thickened." Maya said, "Then we cut it thin and feed it to the light." The safe house smelled of coffee left half finished, and Maya Quinn said, "Jonah, your silence is heavy enough to sink us." Jonah Park stared at the sealed letter, trembling, and said, "It holds more than guilt. It holds her breath." Elena Brooks poured tea slowly and said, "The wound is not the evidence, it's the silence around it." Riley Tran sketched a broken lock, muttering, "The cage keeps whispering her name." Caleb Ortiz leaned on the wall chewing and said, "The hall outside is clean, but not quiet." Maya said, "Every word you guard is a crack in their wall." Jonah said, "Avery hummed when truth was near. I can still hear it." Elena said, "Then carry the hum until it becomes steel." Riley said, "The map shows faces, not streets." Caleb said, "The chain always has a weakest link. We find it." Jonah Park said, "I walked away when the fire took her, and I never looked back." Maya Quinn said, "That silence is the story they're counting on." Elena Brooks touched his arm and said, "Guilt becomes steel only when shared." Riley Tran sketched his face and whispered, "Lines don't lie even when people do." Caleb Ortiz opened a folder and said, "Badge logs show the ghost at 2:13 a.m. Jonas said, "Avery knew the lab was forged, but no one cared." Maya said, "Then we carry her fight into daylight." Elena said, "Your grief is the anchor. Let it ground you, not drown you." Riley said, "Her memory is the ink on every page we write." Caleb said, "Every page makes a target, so brace." Elena Brooks said, "You're safe here, but safety is not the same as freedom." Maya Quinn said the phone call pointed to a handler in evidence, BQ. Jonah Park said, "Avery left clues in margins, not headlines." Riley Tran lifted her sketch and said, "The lock spells a name if you follow the brakes." Caleb Ortiz checked his watch and said, "The sedan circled twice again, tinted windows." Elena said, "Trust bends until it breaks, so choose carefully." Jonah said, "I memorized the escape routes like she taught me." Maya said, "Then the path is ready, we walk it now." Riley said, "The sketch is not art, it's prophecy." Caleb said, "The prophecy better fit in the trunk of the car." Riley Tran said, "You all miss what the walls whisper, but I don't." Maya Quinn said, "Then speak, Riley, because whispers fade." Jonah Park said, "Her hum echoes through every empty space I enter." Elena Brooks said, "Memories are anchors, but anchors also drag." Caleb Ortiz cracked a grin and said, "The sedan isn't patience, it's surveillance." Riley said, "The sketch shows her at the edge of the verdict." Maya said, "Then the verdict is where we start breaking their chain." Jonah said, "Every chain rattles in my sleep." Elena said, "Then wake and rattle louder than they expect." Caleb said, "I'll feed their surveillance a false trail." Caleb Ortiz said, "The sedan parked again. Driver never left." Maya Quinn said, "Victoria Hale's shadow stretches further than the courthouse." Jonah Park said, "Avery's laugh once filled that courtroom, now only silence echoes." Elena Brooks said, "Silence can be carved into testimony." Riley Tran said, "My map leads straight into her office, where she waits." Caleb said, "If we go in blind, we don't come out." Maya said, "Then we don't go blind, we go with truth." Jonah said, "The truth is heavier than the letter I can't open." Elena said, "Then let us lift it together." Riley said, "She is already watching us through windows we can't see." The evidence room smelled like cold metal and rain trapped in concrete. Maya Quinn said, "Box 17 was logged at dawn. Now it's air and dust." Caleb Ortiz said, "The entry pings, but the trail is shaved clean." Riley Tran said, "The tape splice sings the same broken rhythm." Elena Brooks said, "Breathe, then listen for what silence hides." Jonah Park said, "Avery drew a star beside 17 in her draft." Maya said, "Then someone read her map and stole the sky." Caleb said, "The camera angle jumps like a nervous witness." Riley said, "The jump spells a name we keep missing." Elena said, "Truth is patient if we are not." Jonah said, "She tapped her pen when the lie thickened." Maya said, "We thin it with light and time." Caleb said, "Time is what they keep stealing from us." The hallway outside internal affairs rang like a tuning fork struck wrong. Maya Quinn said, "We follow the badge clone to a handler." Caleb Ortiz said, "Or we follow it into a crosshair." Riley Tran said, "Fear is a door, not a wall." Elena Brooks said, choose the door that leaves you standing. Jonah Park said, Avery wrote that the lab chief traded results. Maya said, then we trade silence for truth. A uniformed ally said, you push again, you push alone. Caleb said, stand down, or we lose the corridor. Riley said, he is echoing someone else's script. Elena said, kindness bends, but not to threats. Jonah said, every step sounds like hers. Maya said, then we step louder than their warnings. The courthouse steps crawled with cameras that smiled like sharks. Maya Quinn said, they want spectacle instead of questions. Victoria Hale said, sunlight cures rumor, dear, stand still. Caleb Ortiz said, we can leave by the service alley. Riley Tran said, her eyes are a metronome counting false beats. Elena Brooks said, composure is a blade, bleed-it of edge. Jonah Park said, Avery laughed here once, now the stone only echoes. Maya said, answer 1 and ask 2. Victoria said, ask 3 and lose your job. Caleb said, press bus is blocking our retreat. Riley said, then we draw on the pavement with truth. Elena said, hold your breath, then cut. Maya said, I record patterns that outlive threats. The memorial wall held names like quiet bells waiting to ring. Jonah Park said, I left her in smoke and sirens I still hear. Elena Brooks said, grief is honest, but it can lie about blame. Maya Quinn said, the draft shows she stood against forged bloodwork. Riley Tran said, the sketch lines meet here, like a compass arrow. Caleb Ortiz said, the sedan returned and parked 2 blocks south. Victoria Hale said, the city forgives the useful. Jonah said, I was useful to their silence. Elena said, then become useful to truth. Maya said, open the letter when your hands stop shaking. Riley said, or let me trace the seal and listen to it. Caleb said, we need cover to move. Jonah said, her hum is louder here, and it hurts. The diner hummed with neon, and the promise of sugar that never comforts. Elena Brooks said, let me carry what you cannot say. Maya Quinn said, we share weight, not surrender it. Jonah Park said, every spoon clink sounds like her tap. Riley Tran said, I drew the path through Victoria's office again. Caleb Ortiz said, windows there are mirrors, we could vanish. Victoria Hale said, you mistake reflection for power. Elena said, trust me with the letter's first sentence. Maya said, trust is earned by friction, not softness. Jonah said, softness keeps me from breaking. Riley said, but pressure makes ink bite the page. Caleb said, we need timing and clean exits. Elena said, then I will time the breath between your doubts. The abandoned warehouse smelled of rust and damp wood, and shadows moved faster than breath. Maya Quinn said, the witness chose exile, not safety. Jonah Park said, his past isn't buried, it's chained here. Elena Brooks said, chains rattle loudest when truth comes near. Riley Tran whispered, the sketch showed his face at the edge of the verdict. Caleb Ortiz said, records list him dead, yet his prints logged last month. The witness stepped out, trembling, and said, they promised silence for my loyalty. Maya said, silence is just their leash. Jonah said, Avery trusted you before the fire. Elena said, then honor what burned with her. Riley said, your lines cross the velvet blade's signature. Caleb said, speak now before the walls listen harder. The safehouse lights flickered like nerves cut too close to bone. Maya Quinn said, someone inside bends toward Victoria Hale. Caleb Ortiz said, badge splices narrow it to one of us. Jonah Park said, I walked halls at night, but never opened doors. Riley Tran said, your silence draws lines toward guilt. Elena Brooks said, loyalty is steel until it bends. Caleb said, steel bent once before, I remember. Maya said, you've hidden too well, Caleb. Jonah said, if betrayal breathes here, it will choke us all. Riley said, I saw a shadow sketch behind you. Elena said, trust breaks quietly before it snaps. Caleb said, I sacrificed once for greater good, I could again. Maya said, then prove you haven't already. The subway tunnel groaned with echoes like voices left behind. Maya Quinn said, the Firestarter links pass to present. Riley Tran said, the sketch shows Avery standing where I stand. Jonah Park said her ghost threads through every brick. Elena Brooks said, ghosts don't vanish, they wait. Caleb Ortiz said, tracks log every step, she walked these before the fire. Riley said, she left marks no one else sees. Maya said, every mark is evidence they erased. Jonah said, her laughter lived in these tunnels once. Elena said, then carry the echo until it cuts through noise. Caleb said, noise is cover, but also danger. Riley said, cover me and I'll show you the hidden lines. The file room air was heavy, as if paper could suffocate. Maya Quinn said, logs show Caleb's badge where it shouldn't be. Caleb Ortiz said, someone cloned me, shadows wear my name. Elena Brooks said, shadows only move if light allows. Jonah Park said, Avery's draft named a custodian who vanished. Riley Tran said, I drew him, he looked like Caleb. Caleb said, then my reflection is weaponized. Maya said, reflections don't lie unless invited. Jonah said, you did sacrifice once for greater good. Elena said, would you again, if silence bought survival? Caleb said, if truth survives, I pay the cost. Maya said, or truth pays us all. The council chamber gleamed like a trap polished for prey. Victoria Hale said, order is crafted, not found. Maya Quinn said, control is fraud dressed in etiquette. Jonah Park said, Avery stood here once, trembling but fierce. Elena Brooks said, she was steel beneath silence. Riley Tran whispered, the sketch placed you at her side, Victoria. Caleb Ortiz said, the logs trace your hand across every verdict. Victoria said, power writes memory. Maya said, truth rewrites you. Jonah said, her ghost hums through these walls. Elena said, let the hum become thunder. Riley said, the thunder is already drawn. The trial room vibrated with whispers that cut sharper than knives. Maya Quinn said, this verdict is not ink, it's blood. Jonah Park said, every tap of her pen is louder now. Elena Brooks said, stand steady, storms bend only brittle trees. Riley Tran said, I sketched the judge's hand already signing before the hearing began. Caleb Ortiz said, this is theater, not law. Victoria Hale said, order is preserved when chaos bows. Maya said, justice is not your stage prop. Jonah said, Avery's ghost hums in the silence between words. Elena said, her truth is heavy enough to break the seal. Riley said, the lines show cracks spreading already. Caleb said, then we push until it falls apart. The courthouse basement echoed with secrets, lit by a single swaying bulb. Maya Quinn said, confession doesn't need a stage, only a heart brave enough. Jonah Park said, I watched her vanish into fire and did nothing. Elena Brooks said, silence is a coffin if you keep it nailed shut. Riley Tran said, I drew you holding her hand, the lines don't lie. Caleb Ortiz said, every cover-up ends in a basement like this. Jonah said, the letter was hers, not mine, and I never opened it. Maya said, open it now, before shadows claim it. Elena said, breathing truth is harder than holding breath. Riley said, let me sketch the letter as you read. Jonah said, her words cut deeper than fire ever did. The chamber roared with reporters, yet silence ruled beneath Victoria Hale's voice. Victoria said, truth is fragile, and must be guided. Maya Quinn said, guided by whom? Those who forge it. Jonah Park said, Avery's file bleeds with altered results. Elena Brooks said, alterations fracture even steel trust. Riley Tran said, the sketch shows your hand over every false line. Caleb Ortiz said, Control ends when evidence speaks louder. Victoria said, I hold memory. I decide what history remembers. Maya said, history is not your script to edit. Jonah said, her ghost already rewrote you. Elena said, your empire leans. Soon it will fall. Riley said, the cracks are already drawn into the walls. The courthouse roof crackled with storm winds, truth breaking open with thunder. Maya Quinn said, every storm clears shadows faster than trials. Jonah Park said, her ghost hums here louder than anywhere. Elena Brooks said, your scars don't cage you, they anchor you. Riley Tran said, I sketched lightning around her name. Caleb Ortiz said, storm masks movement, use it. Victoria Hale's voice drifted up from below, cold as stone. Maya said, she fears cracks more than storms. Jonah said, I still hear the fire, but I can stand now. Elena said, then stand for her and for you. Riley said, the sketch shows you holding the sky open. Caleb said, time to move before the storm fades. The courtroom finale burned with tension hotter than fire. Maya Quinn said, your curtain falls now, Victoria. Jonah Park said, Avery's truth walks in with me. Elena Brooks said, compassion holds sharper than fear. Riley Tran said, the sketch completes itself with her name above yours. Caleb Ortiz said, logs, files and maps, all converge here. Victoria Hale said, control does not fall, it bends into new form. Maya said, then break instead of bend. Jonah said, her ghost stands beside me. Elena said, her memory is not haunting, it is witness. Riley said, the lines turn into thunder. Caleb said, this is the strike we've waited for. The courthouse lobby was a battlefield dressed in marble, whispers cutting deeper than shouts. Maya Quinn said, the fallout tastes like ash, but it's still justice. Jonah Park said, her ghost hums softer now, but I still hear her. Elena Brooks said, justice never walks alone, it drags wounds beside it. Riley Tran said, my sketch shows cracks spreading through every pillar. Caleb Ortiz said, the system bleeds and scrambles to patch itself. Victoria Hale's name echoed on every broadcast, fractured between loyalty and betrayal. Maya said, they will dress denial as dignity. Jonah said, but Avery's truth is ink now, not silence. Elena said, ink stains deeper than shadows. Riley said, I see her face between lines of light. Caleb said, the storm ripped the curtain, and now they scramble in daylight. The apartment filled with the hum of betrayal, every corner tasting of false warmth. Maya Quinn, said Elena, you knew before we did. Elena Brooks said, kindness bends, I bent too far once. Jonah Park said, you carried silence like comfort, but it cut us. Riley Tran said, I sketched you with a second face, hidden in shadows. Caleb Ortiz said, every compromise leaves a scar, even if hidden. Elena said, I saved fragments, but fragments cost lives. Maya said, you traded trust for survival. Jonah said, survival without truth is hollow. Riley said, your smile hid debts none of us could pay. Caleb said, the chain weakens where loyalty sells itself. Elena said, I am still here but no longer trusted. The safe house smelled of stale coffee and betrayal that never left. Maya Quinn, said Caleb, logs show your hand more than once. Caleb Ortiz said, steel bends when weight crushes it, and I bent. Jonah Park said, you sold truth for greater good, but it was still a sale. Elena Brooks said, your silence stained deeper than mine. Riley Tran said, I drew you as both guard and ghost. Caleb said, every sacrifice was meant to shield, not shatter. Maya said, shielding them makes you their architect. Jonah said, Avery's name lived in those files you erased. Elena said, you cannot guard us with broken trust. Riley said, the sketch bleeds red at your hands. Caleb said, I carry it even if it breaks me. The attic groaned under dust, yet Avery's memory lingered like perfume. Jonah Park said, Her photo hums louder than any voice. Maya Quinn said, "The draft proves she knew everything before the fire." Elena Brooks said, "She was silence wrapped in courage." Riley Tran said, "The sketch fills itself. She stands smiling in margins." Caleb Ortiz said, "Every file points to her absence as the pivot." Jonah said, "Absence is louder than presence when stolen." Maya said, "Her ghost is not memory, it is evidence." Elena said, "Evidence carries weight, heavier than mourning." Riley said, "The lines burn with her truth." Caleb said, "Her truth is what breaks Victoria Hale's empire." Jonah said, "Her memory lives louder now than it ever did." The alley was damp with neon light, truth weighing heavier than victory. Maya Quinn said, "We broke their chain but our scars remain." Jonah Park said, "Her ghost walks beside me, softer but constant." Elena Brooks said, "Justice is never clean, it drags shadows along." Riley Tran said, "My sketch ends here, with cracks turned into light." Caleb Ortiz said, "I stand with guilt, but still I stand." Maya said, "Every fight carves a price on us." Jonah said, "I paid by living when she didn't." Elena said, "We paid by staying when others fell." Riley said, "The map fades, but the truth remains." Caleb said, "The truth cut me too, but it cut her killers deeper." Maya said, "That is enough for now." The memorial park was silent, except for leaves whispering across stone. Jonah Park said, "I return each year, but tonight the air feels heavier." Maya Quinn said, "You carry her ghost like it's chained to your ribs." Elena Brooks said, "Grief bends when shared, it does not vanish." Riley Tran said, "My sketch shows her standing right beside you." Caleb Ortiz said, "The city still tries to bury her voice." Jonah said, "Avery's hum echoes in every corner here." Maya said, "Then let the echo turn into thunder." Elena said, "Justice lingers even when denied." Riley said, "The lines don't fade, they burn brighter." Caleb said, "Her name is carved deeper than their lies." The safehouse attic was quiet except for the scratch of pencil. Riley Tran said, "I sketched myself into her story because no one else would." Maya Quinn said, "You forced us to see her lines differently." Jonah Park said, "You became the compass she left behind." Elena Brooks said, "Youth becomes fire when truth lights it." Caleb Ortiz said, "That fire burned a hole through their empire." Riley said, "I never asked to be chosen, but I was." Maya said, "You carried weight none of us could bear." Jonah said, "And still, you stood." Elena said, "Every catalyst is scarred but unforgotten." Caleb said, "History bends around sparks like yours." The council chamber stood hollow, power drained from its walls. Victoria Hale said, "Control fractures, but does not disappear." Maya Quinn said, "Your walls crumble like paper soaked in rain." Jonah Park said, "Avery's ghost hums louder than your voice." Elena Brooks said, "Respect earned by lies rots quickly." Riley Tran said, "My sketch shows you falling into your own reflection." Caleb Ortiz said, "The chain you forged has rusted through." Victoria said, "I will rise in another shape." Maya said, "Truth denies you new faces." Jonah said, "History already erased you." Elena said, "Your poise shatters here." Riley said, "The final line is drawn." The newsroom glowed with cold light, every desk whispering unfinished truths. Maya Quinn said, "We recorded patterns until they screamed evidence." Jonah Park said, "Her name is inked into every draft now." Elena Brooks said, "Truth outlives those who twist it." Riley Tran said, "My sketch is finished, and it holds her smile." Caleb Ortiz said, "We walk scarred, but scars remind us of survival." Maya said, "The story prints tomorrow, but its shadow lasts longer." Jonah said, "Avery's memory isn't silence anymore." Elena said, "It's testimony." Riley said, "Her ghost walks every street now." Caleb said, "And Victoria's empire walks no more." The alley's neon flickered, and silence became the loudest sound. Maya Quinn said, the truth lingers sharp and unfinished. Jonah Park said, her ghost does not fade, it guides. Elena Brooks said, justice rarely satisfies, but it marks. Riley Tran said, the last sketch I drew was a mirror, and it looked back at me. Caleb Ortiz said, we stand, scarred, but unbroken. Maya said, her story ends with us but echoes beyond. Jonah said, I walk lighter, but never free. Elena said, freedom is not clean, it's carved from scars. Riley said, the mirror sketch whispers her name. Caleb said that whisper will haunt them longer than we live. I